Good afternoon to everyone. I'm Ana Maria Celis, professor of our law faculty and director of the Center for Law and Religion. Thank you for joining us in this afternoon, this new session in an attempt on continuing with meetings that enrich and help us to get more knowledge in different areas. Each week, our faculty tries to get with a new seminar. So thank you all for being here. As you all well know, today we're going to talk about religious liberty in the United States and basically about the recent developments. As you probably are aware of, the last 15 days there have been two quite relevant decisions from the Supreme Court in education issues. So it's going to be Espinoza versus Montana, but also Our Lady of Guadalupe versus Morrissey Beru. And that one is about Ministerial Exception. And our guest is going to talk about both of them. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Nicole Stell-Garnett from John Murphy Foundation, Professor of Law at Notre Dame University. Professor Garnett's research focuses on property, urban use, local government law, and education policy. In fact, she's fellow of the Institute of Educational Initiatives and the senior policy advisor for the Alliance of Catholic Education, a program engaged in a wide area of efforts to strengthen and sustain Key 12 Catholic schools. I'm going to stop here about Key 12 Catholic schools because Key 12, it's the way in America how they name from preescolar, básica, and media. I mean, from 4, 5 years until 17, 18 years, the whole way. So whenever you see now in a PowerPoint presentation that we're going to have the Key 12, we are referring to that, to pre-scholar, scholar, the whole scholar time. Professor Garnett has many outstanding achievements besides the fact that she studied at Stanford, then Yale Law School, and now she teaches at Notre Dame. So it's really my great pleasure to introduce you. Good afternoon, Professor Garnett.
Thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for coming and listening to me on a Friday evening. So, and I have a couple of children in the background who will hopefully not bother me.
No.
I appreciate being here, and I'm delighted to get to know you all and excited to find ways that Notre Dame Law School can collaborate with PUC.
Thank you so much, and we hope that you will come in live when this coronavirus passes. The floor or the platform will be yours in a few minutes, because before I would like to tell everyone that the PowerPoint is going to be in Spanish, just to follow it easily, the presentation. And we thought it was good to start with 2 slides from the situation in our country, in Chile. I know that there are some from other countries now following us, but I would like you to see the first slide. It's an overview. No, the other one, sorry. Okay. Can you put the first slide, Christian? That one. Here we can see that among all the schools, half of them are from the public sector. Then another, it's not half, less than half, another almost the same one, it's the one that receives public fundings. And there are different types of schools that receive funding publics. And then we have very few, it's like 5% of private sector in education. Okay, just to have the overview in Chile. And then the next slide. The Ministry of Education asks for the religious orientation, but that doesn't mean that the school belongs to a faith-based organization. So you have sometimes schools that belong to public sector that declares about themselves being secular, Catholic, or with other religion. Then the ones that receive, like the charter schools that you have, Nicole, and then the private schools that declare themselves if they are secular, lay, or Catholic, or evangelical or Jew or whatever. So that's what we have. It's much more difficult to get to know which are the owners of the schools, because sometimes religious organizations don't declare in their name that they are denominational schools, and other ones uses names of saints or something that reminds you some religious thing, but they are not property of a religious-based organization. So that's some of the challenges that we have in our country to get to know that. We are going to enjoy a lot. I'm sure that you are going to enjoy a lot of your presentation, Nicole. We should start with you telling us like an overview of what is going on in America, in which are the public and private sector, as well as what is going on with fundings in these organizations in public or private schools, and then get to the other. You can switch the other one. Sorry, Nicole.
You froze for a moment. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so thanks. So I know a little bit about Chile, and it's interesting comparatively to the United States, because unlike your system, we would describe over half of your students in private schools, privately operated schools. In the United States, almost all children are in public government schools. So 90% of children enrolled from 5 to 18 are in government schools, public schools, we call them public schools. Of those, most of those are enrolled in schools that are run by local governments. Of those, 6% are in a charter school. A charter school is very much like your subvention school, subvenciones. They are privately operated, they're funded publicly. They must accept students by lottery. The big difference is that the charter schools and the public schools, by law, but for constitutional reasons, public schools in the United States may not be religious. So charter schools, because they are considered public, cannot be religious, at least not yet. And so that 6%, which is a little confusing because it's 6% of the 90%. I think in Chile you would think of them differently, but they count, the way they count them is they're part of the public sector. So about 6% are in charter schools. About 10% of children attend what you would consider private schools. A majority of those are religious affiliated, although the percentage of religiously affiliated charter schools is declining. And the sectors tend to be, the different kinds of private schools in the US tend to be very different. The religious schools are by and large far more affordable, and the non-religious schools are very, very elite. So then there are about 3% of the kids that are not counted as students, they're not enrolled, and they're homeschooled. For a long time, I couldn't figure out how you got to 100, adding 90, 10, and 3. But I finally figured it out that the 3 is not in the rest. So the 3% of American school-age children are homeschooled. So in contrast to Chile, there's almost no funding in the United States for private school. Now, the charter schools are privately operated and they are funded. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of how few children get money to go to private schools, there are about 57 million school-age children in the United States. About 5.7 million attend private schools. About 519,000 of them receive some money to go to a private school, usually a small scholarship. So many schools, even if there are a few children in the school that receive public funding, the vast majority of the children in the private schools are privately funded by tuition. So even in my children go to Catholic school, we live in a state that does have some funding for private schools. I think about 20% of the children in my children's school receive some government funding. The rest are private funding. So so it's sort of about 1% of the children in the United States receive any money to go to private school. If you don't count charter schools, which I don't, but you might. So about 9% of private school children receive some money to go to a private, it's from the government to subsidize their education. Most of the money that they receive, the scholarships from the government, do not cover the cost of their education. That they have to fill in, either the school itself has to fill in the gaps in cost, or the parents pay additional fees. So there was no private funding there was no public government funding for private schools in the United States, with very few exceptions, like on Indian reservations, until 1990. So since then, a number of states have started to adopt programs that do provide some resources for children attending private schools. This is just a map. So the dark blue is where there are both charter schools and private school choice, which is what we call the scholarship programs. The green is just the private school choice. Some just have charter schools. About half of states now have some funding, but it's very small. So about, let me see here in my English slide, about $706 billion was spent on education, K-12 education in the United States in 2015. And during roughly that time, about 0.3%, $1.2 billion was spent to send kids to private schools. So that the amount of funding available for children in private schools is really, really small. The number of programs available for children is growing, and I expect it will continue to grow, but it will remain the case that the vast majority of children will attend schools that are run by the government.
Okay, and thank you, but is there some explanation from the historical context about this overview, and also which is the current legal framework that allows to have so little fundings for public schools or for private schools?
Right. So so I think, I'll start with just the history of understanding our legal framework and why we have so little. It's a historical reason. It's related to our immigrant and anti-Catholic history. We were founded by Protestants, as you know, unlike your country. There was very little expenditures for public education until the beginning to middle of the 19th century. That's probably true in most countries. But right as the government begins to fund and start schools, most of them are being operated by Protestant organizations. Ministers often were running the schools. Ministers were early superintendents of education in the States. This is the same time large numbers of Irish Catholic immigrants are coming to the United States, and German Catholic immigrants. So our early immigrant history in the United States was Irish and German Catholic history, later Southern European, and more later still Central and South America. But so the Catholics were poor, and there was a lot of bigotry against Catholics and immigrants in the United States. They start enrolling in the public schools, where they find themselves very unwelcome. The schools were very determined to convert them to Protestant Christianity. Children were beaten if they wouldn't recite Protestant devotions. And so the Catholic Church starts its own school system. And it starts it really as a protest, as sort of an idea that this is intolerant for us to send our children to these schools where they're being forcibly converted, told that the Pope is the whore of Babylon, made to recite the King James Bible. And this cartoon, and then the Catholics begin asking for money from the government for their schools. The argument was, your schools are Protestant, our schools are Catholic, give us some money, just on equality grounds. I think this cartoon, which was reproduced in the Espinoza versus Montana case, sort of captures the spirit. This is an 1875 cartoon by the famous cartoonist Thomas Nast. If you look very carefully, you will see that these vicious crocodiles are actually bishops, and the miters are the teeth are the miters, and the bishops are crawling toward this brave public school teacher to eat him, and he's protected by the Holy Bible. And then they're dragging this poor public school teacher off to the gallows. You can't see it, but in the back, obviously this is the Vatican, the back, this says the political Roman Catholic school, and this is the crumbling US public school. So this history is very important to what develops constitutionally and policy-wise in the United States. Americans become very, very attached to government-operated schools as central to democracy, and they come to see Catholic schools, which were at the time called sectarian schools, as being antithetical to American democracy and quite dangerous. And that idea was that we should keep the public government funds away from these schools at all costs. And this becomes part of our education policy. It also becomes constitutionalized. Okay, so in one thing to understand about the American legal system, I don't think this is true in Chile, but I could be wrong, is that we have a federal system, as do you, but our states have sovereignty. So the states enter the union voluntarily, they sort of apply, and they become part of the union. They waive some of their sovereignty as a condition of entering the union, and they become subject to the US Constitution. They maintain sovereignty in other ways, and all states have their own constitution. So any constitutional issues about education sort of have two parts: the federal constitutional issues and the state constitutional issues. The federal constitution says two things about religion. Well, it says another thing about religious tests, but we'll leave that to the side. So the First Amendment to the United States Constitution says, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Although it doesn't seem to be the case, this provision actually does apply to the states. That is for reasons I don't need to tell you about, but it's been applied to the states. So these two provisions of the First Amendment's religion clauses are typically called the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. For many years in the 20th century, it was assumed that the Establishment Clause, the words Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion as applied to the states, meant that the government could not fund religious schools, period. In 2002, the Supreme Court said that wasn't true in a case called Zellman, and it held that the federal constitution allows the government to spend public dollars, education dollars, to help send children to private religious schools. So this is sort of a very big breakthrough. And not surprisingly, after 2002, you see sort of a burst of more public funding for kids in religious schools. So that's the sort of the state side. And then if you want to go, Anita, to the next slide. So what's coming up in this Espinoza case is about that's the federal side. Now we're going to talk about the state side. As I mentioned, and as this cartoon captures, actually the same year, because the Catholics started asking for money for their schools on quality grounds, the Protestants tried to constitutionalize it so that it become impossible. This congressman named James Blaine, he was Speaker of the House, later a senator, he ran for president. His main platform was anti-Catholicism. He attempted to amend the Constitution of the United States to prohibit funding sectarian schools, and that failed by 3 votes. But after that, most states, 37 states, added a provision that prohibits in some way funding private and or religious schools. Some states had to do that in order to enter the union. So Congress would say to the state of Montana was one of them, if you want to become a state, you have to put this prohibition on funding sectarian schools in your constitution. These 37 constitutional provisions in the states, they're typically called Blaine Amendments after this man, James Blaine. And some state courts had said, after this Supreme Court opinion had said, even though the Supreme Court of the United States says the federal constitution does not prohibit funding children in private schools that go private religious schools, our Blaine Amendment does, our state constitution does. So it sort of says, The federal way I teach this is the federal Constitution is a floor, it's not a ceiling. So they said that the floor says we can spend money to send children to religious schools, but we've actually made this separation between church and state bigger. And so even if we say the state of Montana says we can't, and that's really was a major impediment to the expansion of private school choice in the United States. And that's what Espinoza versus Montana is about. So this is a very huge decision. I decided just last week.
So yes, now we should get into the two decisions, the late decisions about Montana and the funding of private schools, and then go through the Our Lady of Guadalupe decision about ministerial exception. So please tell us a little bit more about it.
Okay, so Montana, as I said, these 37 states have these provisions they call Blaine Amendments. They say different things. They don't all say the same, but Montana said it was directly modeled on the federal provision. It was required when Montana became a state. And it said no funding for indirectly or directly for sectarian schools. Montana passes a law that gives a modest tax credit to people if they donate to a scholarship program. It was $150. It was zero. It was so small. The $150 tax credit if you donate to a program that provides scholarships to children that attend private schools. Many or most of the children receiving these scholarships were attending religious schools. So the Montana Supreme Court invalidates the statute. It says this statute is prohibited, this tax credit is prohibited by the Montana Constitution. We know it's fine as a federal constitution matter, but as a Montana constitutional matter, we have more separation between church and state. Montana cannot provide a tax credit that enables people to go to religious schools. And so it just says the whole program is unconstitutional in Montana. So what happens after that is the parents Mrs. Espinoza has two daughters who are receiving a scholarship because of the tax credit. They're forced to leave their school, and she sues and says that the Montana decision invalidating this program violated, remember there's the establishment clause, but there's the free exercise clause. So she says that the decision to invalidate the program and kick her kids out of school is religious discrimination. It was motivated by religious discrimination, a desire, a requirement that the state discriminate against religious schools, and that violates the free exercise clause. So really the federal constitutional question in Espinoza versus Montana is sometimes called the play in the joints. Is there space between the establishment clause and the free exercise clause? Can the states be more restrictive of connections between church and state, more restrictive of funding than the federal constitution requires them to be? And in particular, can the state say any program of funding private schools must exclude religious schools? That was really what Montana had said. The Supreme Court said no. So what really is important, so there's a lot of interesting things about this case. I mean, one thing to point out is this is a position the Catholic Church in the United States has taken for 170 years. I litigated this issue in 1995, so I've been waiting 25 years. But there's several really important things, and this principle extends far beyond education, because the governments in the United States fund lots of things that are private, and there are lots of laws, social service laws and other things that exclude religious providers. So it's not really only about education, but in the education space, it's quite enormous. So the first is the court says you don't have to fund private schools. Nobody's making you. But if you do, you cannot refuse to fund religious schools. The program must be neutral toward religion. You can regulate the schools, or you can choose not to fund private schools. But you can't say we'll only fund secular schools, but not religious schools, because that violates the free exercise clause. So that's really big. And as I say, that has implications far, far beyond just education. In the education space, though, one really important implication is that it means that states can't use their Blaine Amendments to block school choice anymore, which was obviously what would happen is Florida would pass a law and then someone would sue. And after they lost in the Supreme Court, they would say, well, it violates the state constitution. In most states, they can't do that anymore. So this sort of legal impediment to the expansion of school choice is gone. And then sort of even bigger question that it opens up that already people are asking is, well, what about charter schools? So charter schools are privately operated schools. They can't be religious. And even in his dissent in the Espinoza case, Justice Breyer says, what about charter schools? So I expect that there will be lawsuits challenging the exclusion of religious schools from being charter schools this summer. A friend of mine who is actually from Montana, he's the superintendent of the Montana Catholic schools, called me to say, could we get a law passed to allow religious charter schools? So there's going to be, that's really the next, educationally, that's the big question. That would change a lot of things. Catholic schools, I'm not sure about here in Chile, but at Catholic schools after COVID in the US, many of them are closing because they cannot stay alive. They have no public funds.
But you know what? In many of Catholic schools or confessional schools, I mean, denominational schools do have public funds. They belong to these kind of charter schools. There are the vast majority of our schools. I mean, private schools are the 5%. So I mean, they will all probably will have problems, but I mean, they do have some.
They have the money, right? So if we could have religious charter schools, our education system would start to look more like yours, I think.
But then
it's a question raised by Espinoza.
Yes, because you know what? Also, there was a question about if you have private and public schools in United States, do have the same curriculum, or private schools can do whatever they want in that? Because that's an issue for us also. I mean, if you have the public, I mean, we do have to have public curriculum, then you have a 20% that you can go freely in other subjects, but if you receive public funds, does that bond you with a curriculum from the state or not?
No. I think I was in Chile for a conference at the education school a couple of years ago, and I was surprised by how regimented your curriculum was. It's very strange to us. I think it's more regimented than our public school curriculum. So some states, California, others have a system that looks more like yours, like seat minutes, that kind of thing. But the most of the private schools typically do not. There's some minimum requirements, typically like, you have to teach reading, you have to teach civics, you have to teach math, you teach science. Again, the one thing to keep in mind in the United States, we do not have a national curriculum. The states set the curriculum. Even the charter schools do not have to, by and large, they're allowed to have a lot of innovation in their curriculum, although they have to take a test.
Nicole, they're asking by the chat, if you can explain more, how is the charter school issue? Because I mean, in Chile we do have, but they are asking from different parts. I mean, in Chile we do receive public funding for students in schools that decide to be, open to not just private schools, but also to receive some fundings. So you can have some incomes from the state.
Right. So charter schools are, charter schools are odd. This goes back to one question that I think you asked about why we have so little funding for private schools. And our system would look like yours, I think, if we could have we thought we could fund religious schools, but we couldn't. At the time, so charter schools are a compromise. They're a political compromise more than anything. And so for the folks who have been supporting school choice, parental choice, tax credits, vouchers, scholarships. They argue we should have, and one reason I saw someone chatted, why fund private schools? I mean, in the United States, the Catholic schools in particular, historically have been the place that educated the poor the best. So there was these arguments in the 80s, 90s, let's give money to these children to go to these Catholic schools. They're the only places that people are really getting educated that are poor. Opponents of that said, oh, we don't want that. That's dangerous. That's religious. Those religious people are dangerous. So we'll come up with this hybrid, the charter school, which can't be religious. We'll call it public. And so the reason, so 44 states have charter schools. I don't know how the system of approval for the what do you say, subvencionados, I don't know how it works, but in the myth of the charter, well, the way the charter school works is, say I want to start a charter school. I want the Nicole Charter School. I typically don't ask the state for permission to operate. I find some government or non-government entity that's called an authorizer, and I make a deal with that authorizer to tell me that I can operate, and that gives me permission to become a charter school, and that deal is called the charter. And the charter is like a contract. So the charter schools are technically sort of created by these third-party authorizers. In some states, they're the local government. Some states, they're the state government. Some states, they're nonprofits. Each state law is different. I think 99% of these charter schools are privately operated. About a third of them are operated by networks. So some networks, some of the most successful ones at educating the very poor are networks of a couple of hundred schools. So about 70% is just one school. And they technically get authorized by this authorizer. Some states have 2 authorizers and some states have 300. And it's all just sort of, you can't quite get your head around it because of our federalism is so weird.
Nicole, there is someone from the Superintendents of Education of our country who's asking, Maria Los Angeles Serrano, she's asking maybe the difference is that in Chile, the funding goes to the school and in the United States go to the student. And then another lawyer from the Ministry of Education is asking if the funding is received from the state per student for if he goes to school or just for the number. Because in Chile, it's individually, and
right.
Perhaps you can tell us more about it.
Sure. So here, I think it's important to make a distinction between charter schools, and they receive, it looks very much like Chile. It's it goes to the school and it's per pupil, right? So it's and sometimes they may get modest cost for facilities.
For people who attend, I mean, if they
people
don't
attend.
Yeah, okay.
So each child will get, depending on the state, between $5,000 and $15,000 from the state per pupil. The money goes to the school, but it's a per pupil. That's a charter school. So the private school choice is much more complicated. Some of it is a voucher for legal reasons. Until maybe Espinoza, it was assumed that the money had to go to the child because the parent, not the government, had to make the decision to send the child to a religious school. So that on the private school choice, the money technically goes to the child. It's a per pupil amount, and it then is given to the school. I mean, practically speaking, they don't send a check to mom. They send the check to the school.
Yeah, that's it.
So it's per pupil. There are other mechanisms, like in Montana, it was actually no government money. It was just incentivizing donations to a private organization that was giving scholarships. But the sort of the way to think about it is charter schools, it's per pupil and to the school. And the other stuff is per pupil, but to the kid.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Then should we move to Our Lady of Guadalupe case?
So I'm happy to take questions about.
There will be a lot of questions in that too. So
okay, I'm happy to take questions about either case. Our Lady of Guadalupe is a different case. It does not have anything to do with public funding. But I thought it might be interesting because you have so much, it's really an employment issue. And I thought it might be interesting to you because it's probably more of a live issue because you have public funding for lots of schools in Chile. So what happens there were two, in Our Lady of Guadalupe, there were two teachers. They taught, I think, 3rd and 5th grade in a Catholic schools in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. One of them taught at a school called Our Lady of Guadalupe. And they had typical religious school teacher responsibilities in an elementary school. They taught math, they taught religion, they taught science, they took the kids to math, they took the kids to mass, they prayed with them. So they got fired. One of them, and then they sued. One of them claimed age discrimination. Another one said it was disability discrimination. She said she was fired because she was seeking a leave for cancer treatment. So they sue the schools, and the church say these are ministers. And in the United States, the Free Exercise Clause protects something called, that protects the right of the churches, religious organizations, not just churches, all religious organizations, to pick their own ministers. And the reason why it's called the Ministerial Exception, and this is very, very strong. The Ministerial Exception means if it's a minister, the government may not regulate the employment of that person. They can't help you, tell you who you can hire and who you can't, and who you can fire. So the decision to fire these two women would be unreviewable by a court if they were ministers. So the question in the case really went to what is a minister. And what the Supreme Court said was that because these teachers had religious duties, they were instructors in the faith, they are ministers. And it's quite interesting opinion if you're a religious person. Justice Alito goes through all of these different religions and talks about how ministers, some people don't, so that they had said, well, they weren't called ministers. They weren't ordained. They didn't have formal training. And so the court says, well, it doesn't matter. What matters is what they do. And if they're forming people in the faith, they're ministers. And the court makes a big deal of this because it says, otherwise we'd be discriminating against religions that don't have formal clergy. Lots of religions. We're very, very diverse, as you know, ecumenical society. So we need to make sure everybody is protected. So the court says what matters is what they do. If they're ministers, if they're teaching religion, no review.
Nicole, but there was the Hosanna Tabor case a few years ago that was mainly the same, or it was slightly different. So they didn't these other cases. Mm-hmm.
So Hosanna Tabor was a few years ago. It was also a religious school teacher. And the court unanimously said that she was a minister. What had happened in this case is that teacher had formal religious theological training, and the school it was a Lutheran school, and she had, quote, been called. So the lower court in this case said, well, these ladies were called, so they're not ministers. So in some sense, this is more of a clarification.
Yeah. That
you don't have to have title. You don't have to, it's really what your duties is what matters. Now, is this slide, it says basically like what the court says is if the school trusts teachers with the religious formation, we're going to call them ministers, and they're not to be reviewed. But really interesting questions still. That doesn't mean all teachers are necessarily ministers, right? So what about music teachers? Does it matter if they sing songs about Jesus? What about math teachers? What about math teachers that lead their children in prayer? What about law professors? I typically don't pray before class, but during COVID, I started praying with my students. There was this Francis de Sales prayer for peace, and I started praying it because I thought we needed peace. So am I a minister? I think that's a really big question. And then there's this other whole bunch of questions. What about people that aren't teachers? There's lots of employees of religious organizations. And I think those are the questions that will come next.
And which is your guess about that? I mean, how do you think they're going to be solved, those kind of cases? I mean, the music teacher, the guy that cleans the school.
Right. So the music teacher and the guy that cleaned the school are very different.
Yeah.
But I think that there will the current court, the majority, will defer to the extent that is reasonable. The music teacher, actually, one of the big buckets, if you will, a group of ministerial exception cases in the United States are about music directors in churches.
Mm.
So what if the person is not a co-religionist, but is a music director, goes around saying the Catholic Church is wrong about marriage, gets fired? Those cases have typically said the music directors are ministers. The cases that the churches have lost have been the janitors or the secretary. Now, you could make a claim that the janitor, especially in some churches, is a really important witness. But I think that the biggest question for me is, people in hospitals that don't have former ministerial positions, and also college professors, right? So how much do religious universities and colleges have much to hire law professors, or what makes us a minister or not? But those are really big questions. This case, I believe, was quite easy, because at least it appeared that like 25% of their time was spent on religious instruction. And so, they were arguing, well, if they really liked religion, why didn't they hire a full-time religion teacher? Well, as I think Justice Alito said in argument, maybe they can't afford it. So anyway.
And then Maria Los Angeles is asking if you have a kind of certificate of idoneity, I mean, of that you are capable to teach religion of one specific religion or not. Do you have that system in your country or in some of the states? Are you aware of that? I mean, that the religious authority says.
So one thing is to keep in mind, we cannot have religious instruction in government public schools, period. So we can't, the state can't certify ministers. That would be a major constitutional violation. Now, obviously, some churches have that, but I think what the Supreme Court was saying is that they don't have to. So I have a friend who's from West Virginia, and her brother is a minister during the weekend and a vocational education instructor during the week. And he has like 50 people in his church. He has no formal training. And the church, I think the Supreme Court was saying, well, look, we want to protect their religious liberty too, so we're not going to require certification or something like that.
And then they were talking also about a case in Germany, perhaps you're aware of that, of a professor of really small kids, about 5 years old, that used the veil, I mean, the whole Muslim women. How is that in America? I mean, can they, in public schools, this is besides the ministerial exception, it's another case, but what about in public schools? I mean, do you have any notion about what is going on with Muslims teacher professors? Or?
Yeah, so my husband is also a law and religion person, and he would probably know more about those cases. There was a time, I believe, where many courts might have said that was in public schools for someone to wear a headdress. I mean, there were nuns who were public school teachers. If you wore a religious garb, then it would confuse the children. And since public schools should be free of religion, you can't have any confusion. But I think that now those cases, the way the law has moved is sort of what Espinoza says, which is the law must be neutral toward religion. So you could have a rule that says no head covering, and so therefore nobody can wear a head covering, but you can't have a rule that says no head covering if you're a Muslim. Or there are interesting cases in prisons. So your Muslim beard cases where the prison has a rule that says guards may not have beards. And so, but they allow African-American men who have a certain skin condition, which makes it very dangerous for them to shave, to wear a beard, and not the Muslim men. And the courts have said that is a free exercise violation because you're distinguishing between secular justifications and non-secular justifications.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. There's another question, but it goes to other case too. Max Ravest is asking, could you please make some comments about the tensions in the last Scouts cases between religious freedom and discrimination?
The what cases?
Scouts, no, Scouts. SCOT.
SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States.
Thank you.
Yeah, so you're talking about the employment discrimination cases that came down?
Yeah, LGTB rights, etc.
Right. So this term as well, the Supreme Court interpreted our employment statute that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex to include discrimination on the basis of sex. They interpreted the term on the basis of sex to mean include sexual orientation and transgender LGBTQ status. And that's very controversial. It was a 5-4 decision. So one question is, now in that law, there are exemptions for religious organizations.
Okay, I think that that's related to, would you say that whenever pluralism is more plural, then you have to have this interest to religious organizations, or?
So yes, there's two things.
The way application would be the way of solving these kind of issues in your country?
So in the US, obviously, and it's probably true in many countries. I know in Australia, I was at a conference in Australia. Australia is very neat. If you can go there, you should. They have these questions arising too. So in the US, there are many exemptions from religious discrimination and from general discrimination laws for religious organizations when their religion, the discrimination is because of their religion. So there's lots of arguments in the US about what that means. So for example, does that only protect the rights of Catholic schools to hire co-religionists, Catholic teachers, or does it protect them broadly? The ministerial exception is an even bigger exemption from all review, but only for ministers. And then, before the Supreme Court did what the Supreme Court did, I just had a student, he may still be here. One of my students who's LGBT is sitting on my porch drinking with my husband beer because he's leaving tomorrow. And he was very involved in efforts to amend the federal employment laws to include LGBT status, but with religious exemptions. So part of it is political. I don't think that the whole answer can be constitutional. I don't think the Supreme Court can protect religions perfectly. Some people think that what's happening in these cases is the Supreme Court is sort of splitting, I don't know, the American phrase, English phrase, splitting the baby. So Solomon. Anyway, they're saying we're going to give people these rights, but we'll protect religious minorities or religious institutions. I don't know if that's what's happening, but that's what some people are saying is happening. Oh, I can't hear you.
I was in silence. Yeah, sorry. There is another questions that I will make you just in the way that they presented. I have another question too. So, do confessional schools that receive public funding have to comply with the regulations regarding how to use the received funds? Can the state audit confessional schools in these matters, or it would be considered an infringement of the First Amendment?
So they can audit financially. They can and do require, although they typically don't have to do this curriculum, many states require standardized testing. Many states require minimum teaching teaching qualifications. So yes, they can regulate. Generally speaking, in the United States, the state can regulate many aspects of private schools without any concerns about religious liberty. So, but yeah, so they can do that. The states vary in the extent that they do that. Mm-hmm. Pretty dramatic.
Okay. Then Jorge Eduardo Barrera asks, do you see any danger for United States religious schools to be funded by public resources in the future? I refer to the possibility of government constraints on teaching or established admission procedures against their own belief. Chilean experience shows that mandatory minimum curriculum, government rules for admission procedures, etc., have been implemented under the argument that if an institution receives public funds, government can impose their rules. In Chile, these rules have affected adversely religious schools.
So the answer is yes. I think so. There's part of those answer is, am I worried? Yes. The two subparts are, well, three subparts. Either Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Paine said, one of them, Thomas's, a long time ago, said eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. So I often talk to, well, I don't often, sometimes I talk to bishops about this issue, and they are very concerned. We call it the strings problem. There are two things I say. One is that it's mostly a political battle, not a legal one. The second is they can regulate in the United States in many ways that are harmful to religious schools anyway. So they can do, I think politically, if you take the money, there is an argument that it should be entitled to more regulation. I think in particular about student admissions and funding. So United States, typically you can charge more. I know you can't in Chile. You can't, I don't know what the fee rule is, but in the United States, the voucher that would go to my children's school was about $5,000. The tuition is $7,500, which is very cheap, but you could charge the parent the difference. That is harder argument to make. So I do worry. I think many private schools and religious schools in the United States will close without more support. And I think it's sort of unjust that I don't know the situation in Chile, but in the United States, it really is the case, especially Catholic schools have done like really amazing things with really, really poor, disadvantaged children. And they've never been able to participate really in public funding. The other thing that I think that, it's possible in the United States that there are free exercise limits on these strings, but I don't think it's probable. I think it's mostly a political fight. The last question though, I would say, last point is, what scares me the most is that the schools take the money and then they can't live without it. And it either goes away or that there's an imposition that they don't want and they can't afford not to, their choice is close or accept. And some of the schools in my own town on the west side, where there's a large immigrant community, there's some schools that are 100% public funds, almost all Mexican immigrants. If that went away, they would close tomorrow. They were barely staying open before, but that's a concern. I have a concern about it. I don't know the alternative though.
And would you say that those charter schools could invoke the Ministerial Exception as well, or that?
Well, they can't now because they can't be religious.
Yeah.
So right.
But in the future, if you have charter schools that are religious schools.
Yes, so it's something that I'd like to think about. I've been asked to write a white paper on religious charter schools, and that's one of the things I'd like to explore. I do think if they're private, they're really private, and they are really confessional, then they should be able to invoke the ministerial exception. But I think if I were advising some state legislator, I would tell him or her to be clear about that. Right. Okay. And I think that the short term in the United States, we get religious charter schools in one of two ways. Somebody passes a law allowing them, or somebody sues. And the second will come first. It will be here by August. There will be 5 lawsuits by August.
Wow.
I think that's my guess.
Oh, okay. Well, we will follow
up. I don't know,
but
that's my guess.
We will follow up the news. I was just for finishing our meeting now. I just want to tell you that there's an excellent book from Nicole called Lost Classroom, Lost Community, Catholic Schools' Importance in Urban America. So it seems that it's that you have gone very deep on those kind of things, and we are willing to know about your other paper, the one about ministerial exceptions in these new fields or new schools.
Thank you so much for having me. I see there's lots of comments, and if anyone wants to I have no Spanish, but if anyone would like to email me, please feel free to do so.
Thank you very much. And we will, if you ask us to send your email, we will.
Sure. It's on my website as well. Very easy to find.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nicole.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.